We are live. Season's greetings, everyone. Welcome to our third I&I webinar. Got a great little team of people here that are going to be talking about the following subject of digital innovation and the outlook for 2017. It's an exciting time for digital innovation, and we've got three panelists here, one of whom is a regular, David Bovis, and I'll introduce David in a minute, but Victor Newman, who joins us, Professor Victor Newman. He describes himself as an innovation practitioner, and he's an interim executive, as well as being involved on several advisory boards. He has written and contributed to the Wall Street Journal and to the Harvard Business Review, and I'm sure if you go to Victor's LinkedIn and Twitter, you'll get those documents. Industry background, previously with Pfizer, and where he was the Chief Learning Officer for a number of years, and also headed up the innovation strategy and for the Technology Strategy Board at InnovateUK. And he's currently the Chief Innovation Officer at Milamba Group, as well as a number of other executive positions on some various boards in the UK. Joins us from Faversham in the UK today, so welcome, Victor. We're also both ex-Windsor Boys School alumni, although we graduated a number of years apart, as you can tell. Marcus joins us from Munich in Germany. Hi, Marcus. And Marcus is currently the Head of Innovation Strategy and Business Development with Siemens. Everyone will be familiar with Siemens, I'm sure. Leading the way in reliability, automation, and controls environment, or RACE, as Marcus refers to it. Formerly the business strategy head at Siemens, with some background in autonomous vehicle environment and a number of other disruptive, innovative technologies in that industry. Marcus holds a degree in disruptive innovation, and he's just written a paper, an international study on the disruption impact of digitization in a number of industries. So Marcus will be able to give us some real background in some of the findings that he's found over his studies. Then, of course, obviously, David, many of you know, regular on the show. He's the MD at Ducks in a Row in the UK. They're a change management consultancy. David joins us from beautiful Essex this afternoon. David's strong background in psychology and neuroscience, I think, will add a huge level of detail to this discussion as well. And obviously, understanding cultural performance and change, and as it relates to innovation, I think will be really, really important. So, welcome everyone. Thanks for your time today. Appreciate it as we go to the holidays. So what are we discussing here? We're discussing digital innovation, and we are talking about the themes of 2017. I want everyone to tweet with the hashtag #INIShow for any questions. But let me throw the floor open first, and I'll ask everyone to maybe make a short kind of statement on this. But as we come out of 2016 and we start to think about what's happened this year, and as we think about 2017, what are the trends that have matured and emerged for digital innovation this year, and maybe what are the dead end trends that people have seen? I'll throw the floor over to Victor. You give us a heads up, Victor, from your experience.
I think there's been some. There's a contradiction at the heart of this whole thing. There's old value, using digital as a kind of hub and disintermediation strategy to capture the market and get a better return on it on innovation or investment. So there's a kind of efficiency strategy which is about old value, and there's the real potential, if we accept the big data analytics arguments, and people, it's a bit like social media, people keep saying it's about to do something. This contradiction, the bit I'm looking for is, how do we move from efficiency into effectiveness? How do we actually start to anticipate the new value as opposed to exploiting the current value? We think of all the startup methodologies, and the classic that Steve Blank keeps putting out, and it's really obvious, is your startup going to sub-niche an existing marketplace, or are you going to create a genuinely new marketplace? And for me, the bits I'm interested in, and where I'm still kind of disappointed. I mean, I'm still disappointed with the way wearables are working, and the potential for wearables with HMOs, and insurance premiums, and the potential for changing people's behaviour, I think, hasn't been realised on a mass scale. And yet I'm encouraged that the Viper pods that rugby players and football players have been wearing for about 3 years now are actually leading to player management in real time, which is, I suspect, where I think digital could really go.
Marcus, over to you on that. Give us a heads up on 2016 for you, and what you've seen, grow, and what you've seen maybe dead end in the innovation area.
Yeah, let's start in March this year. I think when we all recognize that Google now starts with playing Go and winning against one of the world masters in that game. I think this was really a positive shock in the community, because I read a lot of papers which said, okay, we expected that for 2020, maybe later, and they stated, hey, we made it today. I think for the whole community, it was really amazing to see how close we might be to really a new form of machine intelligence. And this was, I think the discussion around it was very interesting, because some of the people were frightened, say, hey, will that lead to that point where machines become more valuable or more dominant than humans? And I think this is a very interesting discussion. We have to face that discussion, because I think this will be the biggest game changer we will see in human history, maybe since the introduction of the steam machine. So it will really completely change our society, our way we see technology. So I think this was very, very interesting this year. We will see, is it just a hype, and will we see more and more success out of that? But for me personally, it was really a very interesting part of the story. What was for me a dead end this year? Yeah, I'm not so quite sure. I got no one to mention by now. Maybe what we see all this was mentioned, like wearables. We see with this Google, with his watches and with his Fitbits and stuff like that. So this still seems to be in its infancy, and was not that promising that we hoped that it could be, that we could really get closer to the machine. No, this didn't work that way we maybe thought at the beginning.
Yeah, I think the wearable stuff is important to come back to, actually, because I know that was the big kind of 2015, 2014 discussion around innovation, and a lot of organisations were going down the wearable route. But I think some of them now have maybe retracted back to that. But come to you, David Bovis. Give us a view from your angle on digital innovation, and where 2016 has been a success, and maybe otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, obviously digital innovation isn't my area per se, but I think, as we normally do, we can try and link some of the psychology and neuroscience that sits behind some of the developments. For me, I think the world of change and adaptation, when it comes to humans making a jump to a new technology or a new environment or whatever else it may be, is still poorly understood. Sebastian Seung released his book, I think, probably end of 2015, beginning of 2016, called Connectome, and that alluded to the idea of being able to map a human brain to the point, or save a human brain's mapping so that it could be replicated. I think we're in that area now where we're talking about real artificial intelligence, but really starting to understand more of the sort of biomechanisms within the neural construct that, I mean, in intelligence from a digital point of view has tried to replicate in the past. So we could talk about Dilip George and Newman in California, and what they did in terms of mapping the hierarchical temporal memory in the brain that was then used to inform the algorithms used for shopping centers like Amazon to say, if you bought this, you might also like this, because there's some level of common sense to that. So I think there's a lot where I think for me, I would like to see much more I don't know, joint venture type activity between the different worlds. So people working with neuroscientists, because there's so much to be offered from that point of view, and then you can get back into the psychology of why people do or don't adapt in terms of defense mechanisms, and why they can or can't take on board these new things, and what environment we need to create to allow people to become innovative.
Yeah, I think coming back to you, Victor, there on the wearable stuff around the health insurance industry, how is that? You know, how do we get an improvement there? Is that a cultural thing, or is it a mindset and behavior thing? You know, so going back to David's point on the neuro thinking around wearables, and you know, what am I doing here? If my company tells me that I need to wear a Fitbit and they're going to help me get fit, what does that mean for me? You know, do I trust my company? Are they going a bit brother on me?
There's several things I want to say here. I guess the first thing I want to say is that digital is interesting, but it's the data that is exciting, potentially. And so, you know, I wrote about this in 2006, and I got down to writing a paper about this in 2013, where I talked about collaborative value architectures. I think it is happening, hence, you know, a reference to Viper pods on rugby players. I also am aware that, you know, British Special Forces have been wearing similar devices in Afghanistan for a number of years. A, so we could physically locate them if they were wounded and isolated, and we could recover them. But B, so we could actually get the longitudinal data to understand just the sheer, you know, stress that their body was enduring. So I think at some point, actually, were any of you on the London Underground, on the District and Circle line on Thursday? Okay. The good news is, I was stunned. I was so stunned. I had to take a picture of it because I predicted this so long ago. But there was a beautiful advert for a brand called Vitality, Apple Watch with Vitality Health and Life Insurance. So basically, someone's had the balls to do what I recommended back in 2006. They're making the connection with individual customers and employers. In other words, you will get better premiums if you wear the device. And if, in other words, you know, we can actually access that data to begin to understand some of the problems you've got. So certainly years ago, when I was working with the NHS Institute for Innovation and Improvement, I was working on long-term conditions. And I was trying to push this idea of the wearing of devices. And, you know, all the doctors, you know, doctors are basically medievalists. You know, fundamentally, it was very difficult to find doctors who understood about longitudinal data. But I think that, you know, that's basically, that is going to revolutionize the way health is managed, in the sense that, and, you know, and David is an ex-quality man, so he'll understand what I'm talking about. In other words, when we get those data points in real time, we can have an algorithm that will monitor the individual, which will say, you're about to get ill. And
yeah.
we're going to send, you know, we're going to send that nurse practitioner with the syringe or whatever it is to give you that medication that's going to stabilize you. But, you know, I think it's going to happen. And I think now somebody's put some money into an advert on the Underground that's big enough. They know there's the real potential there. So it's going to happen. But I have to say to you guys, I'm interested in that. And I think it's exciting. But I actually think this digital thing's almost a con to some extent, in the sense that, you know, some of the conversations I've been having with people in the city about innovation culture, they've assumed they have to go digital. I said, okay, so what's it going to involve? And basically, they're not talking about new markets. They're not talking about new products. They're basically talking about taking cost out. But I have to say, some of the work I've been doing on, let's say, digital predator. Predator is a technique for tricking people into thinking. Okay, and in other words, you don't have to educate people about predator. You just say, imagine you are the predator business. How would you attack your business using digital? So I've been working with some companies on deep dives involving the digital experience, and you know, fundamentally, it's really, you know, all they're really going to do is that they're thinking tactical, or they're thinking mildly strategic, and they're thinking, you know, go compare.com. And the exciting stuff is when you explain, Uber. And
Yep.
you know, especially with manufacturing companies, they keep doing all this boring stuff about efficiency and lean, you know, which we know is ultimately a dead end. Well, it's useful, but it won't actually save your life. It staves off the end of the product life cycle. You know, you can survive a little bit longer unless you can do some value extensions. And the exciting thing is when you say, think about Uber, and they've all used it, and you say, okay, now do you understand the business model of Uber? And it is a digital business model. And they go, no, let's talk about it. So you build the model, and they go, wow. And you say, look, they don't own the supply, and they don't own the customer. They basically are the network, and that is, you know, the future. And the conversation I have with, you know, with manufacturing organizations, the bit that blows their minds when I say, okay, why don't you Uber your business? You know, let's actually forget this factory that you run. Maybe you should sell this factory. Maybe you should build the digital network that connects customers with products. In other words, do what, you know, Jack Ma's Alibaba 2011. He was the guy who put all the capacity from Chinese factories onto a website, and you could buy it cheap because no one, you know, the capacity was there and it wasn't being sold. And people in Airbnb picked up on that idea, and it was great. So what I'd say is, you know, I think digital is kind of interesting, but the really interesting stuff is when you've, you know, I did all that Internet of Things stuff with Cisco in 2013, 2014, and it was interesting, but they thought it was about digital plumbing. And I found, you know, the key issue is, do you decide to become the network? And the moment you become the network, you have to start understanding business models. And that's when the double or treble-sided business model becomes really fascinating. And I find the only way to talk about it isn't to be academic, but it's literally to say, if you imagine a business that was going to totally disrupt the game, how would you do it? And I find Uber is such a great model for blowing people's minds out.
Yeah. I want to come back to Uber because I think that's an important point. Marcus, you're working in a quote-unquote manufacturing industry at Siemens, although I know they do a hell of a lot more than just manufacture products. You've also carried out this study around disruptive innovation, and maybe there's some points that you can talk about that relate to what Vic said there.
Yeah, I think there is... First of all, I totally agree to what Victor was saying. So it is really necessary to understand the difference between the classical business model and what Uber is doing. So what we looked at our study is, or what we found out is, the more and more the products become digitalized, the more and more you got new cycles of developments. That means you can literally, when it comes to the next level, you can simulate lots of the stuff, lots of what you now have to produce to take a look at it. You can produce it digitally. You simulate it. Sometimes it's called the digital twin, for example. You can test it. You can verify it. You can compare it to the real world. Maybe somehow can use sensor information, sensor data from other factories, and to test it. So. And there is a completely new opportunity for a completely new way of making business, because you now start to sell those digital products. Maybe it could be not really finished, that product. It's just a part of a complete product. For example, look at what Local Motors is doing. So they have a big crowd of designers. They're just working together over their platform. They're just completely designing digital. And then you can start to test it in the digital world. And there is no manufacturing involved in that circle at the moment. At the moment it is, because you have to verify whether it is producible and whether all the raw materials fit together and all the machines can handle that. But think one step further and say, okay, what will happen if we are able to simulate the capabilities of those machines? If we know much more about the raw materials and their handling, and it's not too far away. We see that at the horizon, glimpsing, and say, okay, it's coming. And then we see a world living digital. We have consumers. We can put our consumers or prosumers in the middle and say, hey, you got an idea for a new product? I have a very simple engineering tool here for you, which can be used by nearly everybody, and you design your stuff by yourself, and then you test it with your community, and you blow it out through your community and say, hey, what do you think about it? How would you improve it? And you do that in circles and circles, and you do that very fast, and you do it worldwide. So you can talk to billions of people to testify. And at the very, very end, you say, oh, cool, this is so cool stuff. I want to produce that just maybe 100 times in Shanghai, in some quarter in Shanghai, because there is a production facility which offers production as a service. And you see, this completely disrupts all way of thinking how things are produced. And we are at the brink of it. We are really see what we see from our interviews and our study. We are at the brink. Yes, there is, of course, a way to go, because we need more intelligence, more machines to understand what you really want to do, and then translate it into complex designs. But hey, we're starting it already. We are starting it. All preparations for Industry 4.0, all this preparation stuff done there, all the semantic stuff, ontology stuff, this is all going in that direction. And this is really mind-blowing and really disruptive.
Well, and it's that curate versus create scenario, right, Marcus? So yes. in that scenario, there are information is being curated, and then you're going through that creation phase as you get, and the process is much quicker. Yeah, much quicker. Saying, right. Yeah, so there's organisations that we as an organisation work with, and we're kind of transforming the way that they hire engineering people, right? So they traditionally have hardware engineers, and I'm sure this is the same for Siemens. Is how do you transform a very hardware engineering type organization that creates hardware into more of a software and systems organization? And that whole, the product life cycle is so much quicker, but the innovation life cycle is much quicker as well. And I think that's what a lot of organizations are struggling with.
Yeah, fully agree. So if that was a question, yes, I can fully agree. There is a difference, because when you're used to mechanical engineering, it is very, very expensive to design such a new tool or a new product, and you need special tools, and dissemination is very expensive. And so, of course, you're focusing on quality. You're focusing on waterfall, working like with waterfalls instead of agile at the first glance when you look at it, because it is so expensive. But when it comes to digital, yes, everything changes. You can just test it. You pop it out to the community, test it, get it back, and say, okay, I improve it in this case and in that. And this is a completely way of thinking. And I think it is often very difficult. This is what we found out, that you have a new definition of quality. Once the quality definition was accuracy. It is yes, this part of the car is very good fitting to the other part of the car. Yes, this is of course a high standard of quality, but it's a physical quality. But if people want to have updates and want to have new functionality instantly in their car, they instantly see they define a new way of quality, or they have a new definition of quality. Let me say it in that word. It's not longer the quality of the physical world. It seems to be the quality of getting adopted to my needs very fast. This seems to be a complete shift in quality.
Mark, what about you, Victor? You were going to say something there, I think.
I just wanted to build on that because of my experience in manufacturing. I think Marcus said something very, very interesting. If we go back to the U2 spy plane, they apparently went from concept to first flight in under 50 days. And this was what, early 1960s. What they did was they integrated existing products and sub-assemblies into a new architecture. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. And I think what Marcus is talking about, I find fascinating because of some of the stuff I've done in skunkworks operations, where we've developed prototypes that the corporation didn't want, but until we showed them what was possible, we were trapped in a stage gate methodology that's kind of led nowhere. Yeah, because stage gate, ultimately, it's a great method, but ultimately it can kill innovation based on people's expectations around the business model. And I think what excites me about what Marcus was talking about, it reminds me of, if you like, what we were talking about in 1989. We were talking like this, but we didn't have the digital technology. And we were doing 3D printing in 1989. I remember being involved in that at Cranfield, and we did it. What I think is fantastic, what was implied within what Marcus was saying, is that if there's almost infinite capacity in terms of factories, and we can access those machines to build these sub-assemblies digitally, we're not trapped in a physical location. It means that the potential, and I loved your example of local motors, because that's kind of true. It does offer a freedom of a kind, but it's a very kind of controlled freedom to innovate in terms of making that small batch of vehicles. What I think is fascinating is we could at long last, we could start producing small batch, high value, highly differentiated products through digital technology, using, in effect, integrating existing sub-assemblies in new ways to create new vehicles and new products. And some of these will be digital and modular, but if we think about cars, I think that's going to happen. I think if we think about military vehicles, that's going to happen. And we could actually have specialized vehicles where we make no more than 6. And because we've done all the modeling digitally, and we've integrated it and we've tested it, we won't need to build 100 to get a stable aircraft. We can actually build 3 that work first time. And as someone who's worked in the pharmaceutical industry, where we had to have 99 prototypes to get one drug, and the sheer cost of that drug had to recover the wasted 99 prototypes, I think digital and I'd include Lego Technic in that as well. Digital has great potential for, if you like, integrating existing technologies in new ways to create new products and services, and to do it without having to have the cost of prototypes that don't work. And I think connecting that with business models and digital business models as well, and starting to model customer behavior and testing the hypotheses within those value propositions, I think the whole chain of product development and customer development that has to be parallel could be done largely within a digital space. And for me, that's the real accelerator that I'd like to see.
Fully agree.
David, we talked about quality, and Marcus made a reference around like a new version of quality in the eyes of the consumer. You're coming from a manufacturing quality background and a couple of other industry themes where it's product quality, right, that people are interested in, and it's defect reduction around using Lean Six Sigma methodologies. But thinking about digital and what Marcus said there, what do you think in terms of that aspect?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that sort of popped out that I'll try and put into words. It's very difficult, very complex subject. I think people underestimate quality. People don't understand where quality really starts from. Quality starts from attitude. And attitude comes from confidence, and confidence comes from the environment people exist in, and the pre-programming that comes from parenting from 40 years ago, etc., etc. So when somebody finds themselves in an environment where the glucose energy that exists in the brain is reacting because of they find themselves suffering from chronic stress because their boss is an arse. That detracts from their capacity for their brain to divert that glucose energy to the prefrontal cortex and think logically and make a rational cognitive decision about what they're doing. What they do is they react emotionally, and they react in defense of themselves to protect themselves from any perceived fear. And that comes from the environment. So quality is all about really the decision-making process that a human being goes through when they find themselves in an environment where the glucose energy, the signals, the sensory stimulus from the outside world goes through the thalamus and is directed to the right places, rather than being directed straight to the amygdala because there's some kind of threat, fear, stressor, hormone provocation in the environment. So where people have got high cortisol levels in their system, they're not going to think straight. Simple as that. So we don't consider, from a leadership development point of view, the environment, the psychological conditions, and the psychological maturity of the organisation, what language is used, what threat that presents, and all of those issues. So quality, in that sense, for me, is underestimated, because we think about it in terms of Gaussian bell-shaped curves and process control and control charts and standard deviation and all that kind of stuff. And it's a million miles away from what actually makes a business capable of performing to a high quality level. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is talking about, I think Marcus said about the classical business model, understanding what a classical business model looks like, so we can understand what it looks like to move away from that. If we think that 99% of the people employed on the planet have been exposed to a classical business model, then that means they've got a neural construct for that model that they're used to existing in. And we have to understand neurogenesis and what it takes to allow a brain to make that adaptation over what time periods, given what stimulus, if you're going to get people to not feel threatened by moving away from what they're used to. So it's great to have new innovative technologies and present these to people, but to think they're just going to adopt them is just ridiculous, because it can't happen. People don't work like that. Our brains are not programmed to make that adaptation at those speeds, unless we see huge benefit, because it comes back to that Whiffen principle, what's in it for me, or we perceive huge fear, and so it's too scary to stay where we currently are. Controlling through fear is standard, because that's what we all do, don't touch that, otherwise you'll get smacked kind of mentality. But that's, or you do this well and you'll get a reward, you'll get a bonus, you do this poorly, you'll get sacked. It's a fear-based mechanism in which we control. It's very sort of, I don't know, I've lost the word, but anyway, so that's another thing. So there's this capacity to try and have to change habits. And then the last thing I think I'd point out that struck me based on what the guys were saying there, is that our brains require sensory stimulus and feedback from our modalities and submodalities, i.e. our primary forms of stimulation, which are our five senses, our eyes and ears, and the combination of those things, which is referred to as synesthesia when it gets mixed up and crossed. It can actually be quite valuable to look at the world a different way. So if we are removing the interaction of people with physical things, and it's all becoming digital and detached on a computer screen, and the only thing we interact with is a keyboard and a mouse, what does that do in terms of neural construct, a capacity to set context, to understand why mating parts do or don't fit together, what spins on what when it's a mechanical product, etc. So there's a few things there that occur to me, and that you might be able to make that into questions for the guys, I'm not sure. So one, how do we get people to shift from existing habits to new habits being presented with digital that they might not believe in? Two, how do we make sure that we don't reduce what we're capable of doing as human beings at a neural level and a psychological level, given the fact that we move everything into a computer and away from the real world? So, yeah,
and I think that's something that I wanted to come on to, and actually someone that's Umair has joined from London. He's asked a question about risk and rewards of innovation, and particularly as everything moves to become digital, we think about things like concerns, and Umair's question is, does anyone have any concerns about the digital footprint being mapped out in such detail that we lose everything with one hack, right? So that the scenario of disruption around corporate hacking and that type of activity, how do you manage internal innovation, where a lot of the innovation is also put out on the external market, and Marcus, you made that point, right, around how do you bring people into your innovation circle. That wasn't a word that you used, but I'm kind of want to use that word. Do you then risk losing the benefit of that innovation because of that?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. Yeah, I think there is no solution yet, because we are just in a shift. We see a shift between thinking inside the borders of our company and developing those innovations on one hand, and we see that complexity and development out of the world is so it's so fast that we are not able to cope with a crowd doing the same thing. So we are constantly now confronted that things which were offered 30 years ago as in a patent is now open source. think of all this stuff in these autonomous driving economy, which is now where now more and more companies popping up and say, hey, we make that public. There is no patent, there is public source. So we are confronted, every company is confronted with that motion. And because people are interconnected worldwide, you cannot stop it. So if someone wants to tell it to the world, he will. And we have enough genius, but when we now 7 billion people out there, there are enough genius going public. So we have to face it, and we have to find other ways than just patent things and having innovations in a closed environment. But you have to get used to that. This, for example, we have found a crowdsourcing platform within Siemens. So people can bring in, it's like Kickstarter, for example. It's like a normal crowdfunding platform out there, but it's specifically adopted to Siemens. And this is to get people used to it, to talk to other people, to have a crowd. We have 370,000 people out there. So this is a huge crowd to talk to, and it's nearly public. And so people get used to it again, to talk to each other, to present their ideas, to vote for it, to get money for it, and to stand for it, and to make really a project out of it, to foster entrepreneurship, we call it. And I think this is one of the steps to get used to that way of doing innovation. So doing half inside the company, being very aware of your core competencies, so what you can protect. And the other half is really going out there and getting all that knowledge and all that wisdom which is out there and incorporate and give it back to the society in some way. But this is a really complex way of learning, and to cope with that, because we are not used to it. And so, yes, it takes a while, but I think there is no other way. I don't see any other way by now.
Victor, you've obviously been in an innovation role, back when you were at Pfizer. How did you deal with that? The risks and reward of that.
Well, ironically, I got much more intensely involved in innovation when I left Pfizer. In fact, there was a beautiful moment in 2003 where a group of scientists said to me, you come from an academic background at Cranfield, and what's it like being in a business environment? And I said, you're not going to like this, but Cranfield was a lot more business-like than you guys. In other words, they were locked into their medieval craft system.
As you were leaving, it was your final stab, wasn't it?
I had another 2 years. I also led an exercise called Box Logic, where I got everybody in. We ran this as a closed room exercise, where I got 4 different sites to try and ask themselves the same question, like, why do we spend all this $7 billion a year? What are the assumptions behind our investment strategy in $7 billion a year in drugs? And we came up with 16 driving assumptions. We then tested these. We found 6 were partially true. 11 were obsolete and no longer operated. Of those 6, 3 we had to rewrite completely within the new context. So, ironically, I've been involved in innovation much more since. And one of the things that happened sort of 2006 onwards, I got involved very much in open innovation, which is what Marcus has been describing. And it's interesting, Allianz has done some interesting stuff as well. And I guess if we were kind of cut to the chase, I think the beauty of digital is that we can turn products into services. And we can also turn services into products, and that beautiful cycle that no one talks about. I think that's really where it's at. But I guess, I kind of go back to where I was before. I see digital as kind of interesting, but the real issue, don't get hung up on digital. Get hung up on value. Digital is just a means to end, but it does enable an enormous potential. I would say, just keep saying to yourself, are we going to create, unique products? Are we going to create niche products? Are we going to create tribal products? Are we going to create commodities? And essentially, once you've got that model in your head, you know that the unique product is going to become niche, is going to become tribal, is going to become commodity. And you also know that you can push it the other way by wrapping branding that catches people's emotions and sense of identity. You can take a commodity and turn it into a niche product just by playing games with people's heads, which is, where David Bovis comes in potentially. Fundamentally, it's a great game, but I would say digital is purely a means to an end. The real end is the creation of value. And the point about IP that has been mentioned, the thing I learned back in 1995 onwards, if I can have an idea, then probably 200 similar people across the world will have the same idea. And then, picking up on Marcus's point, then the issue becomes, can I create an environment that could be digital, but it could also be social, where I can connect with people who have got the missing pieces to turn that value, to realize that value in the form of a product or a service, and do it fast. And that's it.
Yeah, I think fast is the piece, right? That's where digital has a huge has a huge benefit over everything else. As you were saying, Marcus, right at the start, in terms of being able to turn new product innovation around much quicker over a digital platform than over a physical platform. Definitely. I want to come on to building an innovative environment, because I think David, you touched on this in terms of some of the neurological activities that either dampen or heighten innovative environments. And everyone, if you go on LinkedIn, someone at Google or at Facebook is going to post a picture of their office, and it's going to look like a children's playground, and it's going to be this creative hub. So I guess that's at the far end of the scale. But if you think about an organization today that maybe is going through a digital innovation and thinking about innovation hubs, a lot of banking and financial services organizations are starting to go down these innovation hubs. What would you do, if you think about creating and building an innovative environment in your organization or in a previous organization? How would you go about doing that if you were coming at this with a blank sheet of paper? And to Victor's point, what expected value, and how quickly do you expect value from those environments?
I think the key is safety. Human beings can't think, because you're talking really about the difference between beta, alpha, theta, and delta brainwave cycles. So the brain works and makes much better cross-reference from 20, 30, 40 years worth of history that's wired in there when it's in a relaxed state. So you go to that point. Do you realise when you're driving along and you realise you've lost a couple of miles and you don't remember that part of the journey, but you've been thinking about some other stuff that's really random, and you've pieced together stuff over 20 years, and suddenly you've got a solution to something that you couldn't think of in the meeting that you just left, but you got it while you're driving home. So that's the kind of real brain wave activity element that you're trying to create for people if you want true innovation, because that's when we link the word innovation to the way the brain works, that's the kind of neural state we're looking for. So for me, it becomes safety. In terms of, I mentioned to it in one of our other chats. I think it's the one that was banned for various reasons through people not wanting to see their employees drinking on the screen. But it was the physical, the risk, the emotional, the social, and the systemic. My PRESS model, PRESS. So whether you've got a safe physical environment and the amount of stressor hormones that can be triggered by the noise or heat or cold or whatever else it might be people are exposed to, the amount of risk that people perceive to themselves and to the business, the level of safety in their job, how long it's going to last, whether they're good company in the market, the personal emotional situation they find themselves in, whether that's from a historic printed point of view, from a 4-phase imprinting perspective, or the emotional state they're in right at this moment, whether they're happy at home, got children on the way, highly stressed because of pending babies being born, etc., etc. The social environment, the dynamic of the team they're in, and then the big one for me is the systemic element, because if you go back to Seligman in the 60s, you've got the this issue of learned helplessness, which means that the adult mammalian brain will very quickly adapt and respond negatively to being restricted, to say that I can't do this. So you can't ask people to think outside the box and then put them in a systemic or a system, i.e. the computer says no kind of system, that doesn't allow them to do anything. You know, like some, let's say, ERP systems that won't let you fill out all the information because you can't tick a box on the first sheet, so you can't get to the second screen and that kind of stuff. That's systemic control that gets people to just shut down. So you need that to get people to choose to create conditions that are informed from a psychological, neuropsychological perspective. You've got to really address leadership and what they fundamentally believe in. Victor said something about assumptions earlier, and that he had to challenge 16 assumptions. I think it was at Xerox that said to understand change in any meaningful way, you have to understand the policy behind the process, the rule behind the policy, and the assumption behind the rule. And I don't think you really get many leadership teams these days challenging the assumptions behind the rules by which they set policy that then determines what you can and can't do in process. So you have to get back to values, motivation. We can throw in Simon Sinek and why, you know, in his Apple example about why do you exist? What are you in the world for? What are you trying to achieve? When you fundamentally understand as a leadership team what it is you want to do, whether it's good in the world through developing drugs or developing the next electric car to save the planet from fossil fuels, then you've got a motivating factor, something that people can really buy into. But not a lot of companies or teams, especially in SMEs, have that conversation. They don't know why they exist. They're there to make money. Sometimes it's a lifestyle choice. And in those environments, it's very hard to create the prevailing conditions in which innovation can flourish.
Yeah, Victor, let me come to you on that.
Okay. I'd like to kind of replay what David said, but using perhaps simpler language, if that's okay. Sorry, no, which I agree with it all, but I think it can be confusing, especially if you wear a white coat and you carry a syringe in your hand, perhaps a stethoscope as well. If I sort of come up with a serious hypothesis, I think one of our problems is that probably the majority of people are gaming. They're going through the motions. The learned helplessness, Seligman, that David was referring to, is, a lot of people are pretending to work. They're pretending to be engaged. Okay, and that's okay because it's sort of acceptable. And I would argue that if you really want to change that, then we have to move from outside in to inside out. So, I've been in situations where we had to teach the same innovation stuff 3 times before people realized we were serious. Yeah. And I always remember, my first piece of research into the implementation of lean. And what was it that characterized successful lean implementations? It was when there was no alternative. You either did it or you died. And once people got the message that we either do this or we die, if we go to Port Talbot, look at what happened in that steelworks. Now, we know that the European Union was deliberately attempting to destroy that plant, by the games they were playing with steel production. But look at what people in that plant did in a period of 4 months. They turned it around because they stopped playing traditional trade union games and management games. They just said, we're not going to do that stuff anymore, because they looked around and they knew if the plant was gone, the town was gone, South Wales was probably gone as well. So ultimately, they had that moment of truth. And I think, gaming is our problem. And the games that people play, and, there's a wonderful book about that, essentially our problem is that people are gaming, they're going through the motions, and they think they're working. They're convinced that they're working. So essentially, let's say there are 3 behaviors that are useful for us. If we want to help people to change, we can tell them to change and we can bully them. They will change when there's no alternative. But if we actually want them to be involved in this change process, then I think we have to do some calculation And I would suggest doing what I call calculating. Do you have a kind of innovation capacity that is positive, or do you have an innovation capacity that is negative? And what I mean by that is, if you look at the ratio between powerful behavior and behavioral waste. And behavioral waste is, if you like, that combination of defensive behaviors and helpless behaviors. And so if I want to change your organization, or I know it has to change, I have to deal with all the defensive behaviors that people have got, where they switch on blocking behaviors. Now, I always remember working in the financial sector a few years ago, where a guy, the new CFO was in effect constructively dismissed, and he asked me to do some research as to why he was being edged out with a nice package. He said, look, Victor, before I go, because of this enormous rate of consulting that you charge us, could you find out why this happened? So I talked to people using one of my techniques, and they said, listen, tell him not to worry. We did this to all his predecessors. So, fundamentally, individuals are carrying behavioral waste. They're carrying defensive behaviors, and they're not even aware of them. And those defensive behaviors in managers lead to, if you like, micromanagement of subordinates. And when a subordinate is micromanaged, they become helpless, because they say, he doesn't trust me, she doesn't trust me. What's the point of doing the job I was paid to do? Because they always check what I'm doing. I'll just sit here and become helpless. And if I become helpless, that then justifies the micromanagement, and the defensive behaviors lead to helpless behaviors. We get this zombie cycle. Basically, this is how you create a zombie organization. Now, ultimately, it is possible to actually, for at least 2 occasions, third time it doesn't work quite so well because they see you coming. But fundamentally, it's possible to use a simple diagnostic to actually quantify the ratio of powerful can-do behaviors to behavioral waste, which is that combination of defensive behavior and helpless behavior. And it's amazing when you actually show people the figures individually and they go, whoa, I didn't realize how much of my personal portfolio is basically defensive, helpless stuff. I don't actually have enough can-do to actually, if I look at the ratios, there isn't a surplus of can-do. I'm actually swamped with helpless defensive behaviors, which means I don't actually take anything forward. I'm constantly finding excuses for why things can't be done. Now, if you have that conversation at an individual level, and if you then aggregate the scores, it's quite amazing. I've done this with police forces, I've done this with certain boards of certain organizations. We've actually been able to see why innovation isn't possible. It's when we added up all the scores and we looked at the distributions, and we could actually see that those who actually were in a mental state of can-do, they were up for it, were actually in a tiny minority. They were constantly being blocked by people saying, it can't be done, it's too difficult. And, maybe someone else will sort this problem out. And I think that fundamental understanding of, if you want to change, don't give people a lecture, let's say, on biomechanics. It'd be useful. I would say, David is absolutely right. Start with leadership teams. Start with helping those leaders as individuals to understand what they're doing to themselves and to their families. And then it's possible to unpack that behavioral waste into what we call personal behavioral waste, understand where you do this stuff. Do you do it in your family? Do you do it at work? Do you do it with your colleagues, your subordinates, or with your leaders? And how much of that stuff is cultural? How many stories are there in your organization that say, don't bother, the bastards will screw you down? Don't bother, just go through the motions, play the game. And the final one, stories are really important, especially with CEOs, because I always feed those stories to CEOs and I say, do you believe that people believe that 80% of what we spend on this is a waste of money? And they go, whoa, is it true? And we then go and audit it. And it turns out that usually 60% of those stories are not true. But if people believe they're true, they go, what's the point? And they go into behavioral waste. Now, the final bit, which is where David is absolutely right about quality, and what he said about quality, is systemic behavioral waste. In other words, you've probably got work practices, which could be SharePoint, could be workflow, could be routines, disciplines, template documents that have got embedded behavioral waste, that give people a message that say, forget it, go through the motions, play the game. Nobody cares. And I think if we can operate inside out, start with personal behavioral waste, and then start looking at the cultural behavioral waste, the stories that people believe are true about how you get on in this organization, and maybe they are true, and then finally look at the systemic behavioral waste, the stuff you've actually got engineered into your digital systems as well as your physical systems and your processes that tell people it's acceptable to play games. And you look at what's happening in our police force, you look what's happening in our government. The only organisation that hasn't had to play those games has been the army, and that's because they've had to fight for survival in some extremely dangerous situations. But I would say look at the behavioural waste you've actually got, but deal with it individually, and then as a group, and then as an organisation.
Marcus, let's come to you on that. There was a very broad, but also some very, very valid and poignant points in there as it relates to kind of innovation and building the right innovation environment. What would you say as someone in a very big organization with 174,000 employees?
So getting the right, just to get you right, to get the right environment together for innovation.
Yeah, I think building the right. How do you build the right environment? Victor's talked about a lot of those points in there in terms of gaming, but I think the environment is key as well, right?
Yeah, I think this is one dimension. This is gaming stuff, and especially people go to that mood if they are not recognized as important as an important part of the game, then they change to that mood. So this is what we did. What I mentioned beforehand is this crowdfunding platform we established. This is one example how to get people again out of this zone, to get them motivated again. And you can roll out worldwide to all employees, because you just give the power of the budget back to the people and say, okay, we spend a neutral budget, let's say of 500,000 or €1 million. It doesn't matter, the amount is not that important. And you people, you can decide what kind of ideas shall be funded with that money. So you can decide, you can bring in your ideas, and the others can decide how much money they want to spend on a single idea. And at the end, it is guaranteed that the ideas who won have really this money and can work it out. And this seems to be very technical at the beginning, but if you go more deeper, it motivates people again to think about, okay, what is important for our company? And this is what turned out from our tests. First, our management was very reluctant, because they said, hey, will they spend their money for barbecues or maybe for a beer tent or whatever will they do with that? And it turned out, no, people are very, very responsible with the money they get from the company. They have really ideas which drive forward the innovation of Siemens. Maybe sometimes just minor innovations, but they are involved. They get, again, part of the company. They see that they can make a difference. And this is, for me, one big example how even a very huge companies like ours can start shifting. They can, again, get those sleeping or gaming people getting, again, involved. And it turned out it is a very, very good tool to do so. And this is just one example. I have several others, but I think the others have some too.
I want to come back. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I just want to ask one final question. I think it kind of follows on from what you were talking about there. There's a lot of talk now, and as we go into 2017 around this, is innovation best in a startup environment, or is it best in a large corporate giant environment, right? And I speak to a lot of corporate clients who are like, well, part of our digital strategy is we're going to look to acquire a startup, look to partner with a startup, look to JV with an organization. Going back to Victor's point, most individuals in a startup organization, I would imagine, aren't gamers unless they're actually in the gaming community. So how do we, if we think about big corporate world versus startup world, what is everyone's views there? Where do we go with that as an organization? Maybe I'll come to you first, Marcus, and because it kind of follows on from what you were talking about there.
I think there is no ultimate truth. I think this is it really depends. So if you're a company which is able to embrace new companies like startups very quickly and getting part of your company, moving that way could be yes, maybe the only or the perfect way to choose. But I think often the truth lies in the middle. So yes, it is of course important to embrace startups and to look at, because they are fast, they're sleek, they're very involved, but on the other hand, they have to fight for money. They have to waste lots of their time for things which are not focused on the product. So this is where the strengths of big companies come in. They are their own venture capitalists, and so they can use that. And like Siemens, we have really brilliant people. We have 370,000. So there are a lot of brilliant heads. So the difficulty is, and we start that with Next 47. This is our idea for that. We say, okay, we build our own startup incubator stuff within Siemens, where you can bring in all your ideas. You have a safe environment on one hand, but of course you are challenged. You have to go for it. Yeah, it's not easy money. You have to fight for it, and but you have the power of Siemens in the background. We are more in 160 countries, so we can open up markets. We have a huge sales force and stuff like that. So we try to combine both, getting this spirit of a startup together with the power of a company. But we are at the beginning, so we are trying that way and we are going for it. But I think it's a good idea to start with, and I'm very optimistic that we'll see some very cool innovations out of that in the next time.
Great. Victor, what are your views on that? Startup versus big corporate?
Okay, I'm going to say three things. A list of three is always good. Number one, have an innovation process that everyone can see and play with. And as you know, as I keep finding in pharmaceutical organizations, they think innovation can only be about drugs, in spite of all the examples about services being developed that actually mean drugs become interesting but almost irrelevant. So number one, have an open innovation process that's based on value. Secondly, I'd say get the right people involved. So start thinking about, do we have creators, translators, stabilizers, and navigators? And are we involving them in this process at the right time? And can we help people to understand, who those people are in the organization? And I guess the final one is help people to learn how to think like a startup. And I think key to that is getting people to commit some of their own salary into that exercise, because that means people get serious. And I think understand, if you like, the revolution that Steve Blank still hasn't understood in his book, even though it's an excellent book, that essentially we need to teach people value proposition modeling as well as business modeling. And those two together help people to construct value propositions and test them again and again and again on real people. And I think those three things, the ability to construct value propositions around new ideas and to test them so that you develop the product and you have the customer development in parallel working together, those three things, process, people, and think like a startup. So the advice I was giving I was giving the prizes and innovation awards for a European conglomerate a few weeks ago, and they were giving prizes for great ideas. And I said, how many of those ideas have you actually tested with real customers? And there was a sort of stunned silence.
They didn't give the rewards out then in the end.
No, I had to get my coat and leave at that point.
David, finally for you, give us a view on from your end.
A couple of last points that pop out from what the guys have been saying. I'm going to argue the case for people, adopting the complex language. I know Victor said we'll put basically what I said in simpler language, and I'm not defending myself or suffering from a psychological insecurity, Victor. But I think
you'll be on the show next month, David. Don't worry, we're not.
Good. I always refer to Wittgenstein. He said the limit of my language is the limit of my world, and I think it's really, really true saying. It's fantastically powerful, because the only way you really can get to root cause, going back to sort of lean tools and techniques, we're talking about root cause analysis of the people involved. We root cause analyze process and systems all day long, but to root cause people, you've got to talk about psychology and neuroscience, and unfortunately that comes with a different set of language. When we can get leaders speaking a little bit more of that language, we can have a much more meaningful conversation than we can when we keep simplifying it. And it goes back to more sayings like, was it Einstein said, I wouldn't give you a penny for simple on this side of complexity, but I'll give you my life for simple on the other side. So what we've got to do is get people through the complex, get them to learn the language, and then understand the simple. If we can do that, we're winning. If we try and dumb it down so everybody can understand it with simple models, sometimes that's not enough because other people have to go through the thought process to really understand something in context as well. So that's my little bit of defense coming out there. The bit that appealed to me, I think, from what Marcus just said, was that people can see that they can make a difference. And that really comes back to intrinsic motivators, and it links exactly to what Victor just said. You know, get people to sacrifice some of their salary share, get skin in the game. You take things seriously when you use the risk of you losing something out of it, and that's what startups have to do. I guess the challenge in the bigger businesses. One more point on the intrinsic motivators first. Again, to prove the point about language. There's a thing in the brain called the dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway. It sounds incredibly complex and it scares people off. And anything new, if you haven't got a neural construct for that sentence, that group of words, immediately is a threat because you can't integrate it with anything you normally have. You start breaking it down. Dopaminergic, it responds to dopamine. Mesolimbic, it sits above the limbic system. Yeah, and pathway is a pathway of neurons. It's not that difficult when you start chunking it. So you can understand that you've got an opiate-based receptor that makes you feel good if you feel like you're making progress towards something. So when it comes to goal setting and understanding intrinsic motivation, if you expand the language a little bit in terms of the DMP, the dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway, then you can get leaders to have a meaningful conversation about those issues. That then links back to the last point I've got that stood out from all of that is in terms of communication complexity. I think where Marcus was saying that you've got the spirit of the startup but the power of a corporate, the challenge goes back to the point that Victor and I made earlier, which is that you've got barriers from assumptions that are pre-existing and pre-wired in people's brains about how you behave in a big organization. And if you've got some people trying to act with the spirit of a startup and they hit those barriers of corporate mindset and attitude, then you can't get that innovative flexibility and responsiveness that you get in a smaller environment. And that comes down purely to communication complexity, because the larger the group, the less efficient it becomes. And then finally, Victor just said, process people and think like a startup. The key word for me all the time and every time will always be think. It's how people think that determines their behaviors, their actions. All those behaviors Victor described earlier, all got a root cause in somebody's thinking pattern. And that comes from, again, their environment, the way they're programmed. That goes back to that press model, the emotional and social conditions they find themselves in. So that'll do for me. I talk too much.
Well, let me wrap this up. I want to say a massive thank you to everyone that joined. So you know, we had a good number of people that were online watching the webinar, and obviously this will be available off on a web link after the show for those that signed up. Big thank you to Victor. Thank you so much for your involvement in this session. I'm sure people will hit you up on LinkedIn and the other social medias that you're on for your wise words of wisdom, and I hope your papers are available for people to download and review. Marcus, as you said at the start, your study is currently in German only today, but will be available in English at the end of January, correct? For if people want to read about disruptive digital disruption in various industries. And big thank you for joining us from Munich. I know it's late into the evening there, and thank you for your time and the wisdom that you shared on that relates to Siemens, and some really great commentary in there around open innovation. I think is a key message, and crowdsourcing internally within an organization of 370,000 people, right? You know, that's bigger than some European countries. And then obviously David, again, thank you so much for your words. The dopamine is being released as we speak. Many people here, and I'm sure offline people can again get in touch with you for some more neuroscience related words of wisdom from you. I want to thank everyone. I want to say happy, all the best for 2017 for everyone here. Season's greetings and happy holidays from here in New York, and thanks everyone for joining.
Cheers guys, thank you.
Have a good evening and good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.